Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 worst cards from Journey to Unguro. Now, someone might ask, why on earth do we care about the worst cards in an expansion? Well, first off, I think it's just fun to talk about these kinds of things, but secondly, it actually can help people out there who don't really know which cards they might want to disenchant, which cards they should avoid crafting, the kinds of cards they should avoid putting into their decks just in case something looks enticing but actually at the end of the day just isn't all that strong. And there are quite a few cards on this list that fit exactly that description. So all that said, let's go ahead and jump into this list and define the very worst cards from the expansion. Starting off at the number 10 spot is a very surprising card to see on this list, because right before the expansion, this was certainly the most talked about card, and a lot of people around the community thought it was going to be blatantly overpowered. But as it turns out, Hunter's Quest, the Marsh Queen, is actually pretty darn bad, and in fact, we still haven't seen a really high tier Hunter deck arrive with the Marsh Queen, and frankly, most people who try to build a Marsh Queen deck end up with a failed Hunter deck that just cannot compete on the ranked ladder, because as it turns out, the deck just runs out of gas a little bit too fast in this expansion. Sure, there might be cards in the future which make this more viable, but as it stands right now, actually trying to build a deck with this card just makes you actively worse on the ladder, as opposed to just running good Hunter cards in a face or mid-range deck. So since the Marsh Queen actually hurts you when you include it in a deck and try to build around it, that's why it deserves its spot on this list. Up next at the number 9 spot is one of the many vanilla minions essentially on this list. These are the neutral cards from Unguro. Now that said, Unguro did actually have way more good neutral cards than the average expansion, but of course there are still some of those sort of pack filler cards just tossed in that seem like they don't really ever plan to be played a bunch, but do deserve spots on this list because they ultimately are bad. This one, Sabertooth Stalker's problem is that it just has 2 health, and that's so susceptible to basically every kind of AoE effect. This is the kind of card that just dies when you play it. Unlike Stranglethorn Tiger, a classic stealth beast, which has 5 health and tends to survive, the upswing for additional attack here is just not worth the risk of it dying so easily, in particular when you consider it still has 10 total stats, but it costs 1 mana extra than Stranglethorn Tiger, so there's just not really any decks or environments which make sense to play this card over that one, and therefore it just hasn't seen any play in constructed format. Moving on to the number 8 spot, it's Druid's Evolving Spores. This is just a big board buffing style card that theoretically would make sense in a token Druid deck, which has been really popular on the ladder in Unguro, but unfortunately this is just a worse version of other cards that Druid has access to that tend to buff their minions, and often do so even cheaper. For instance, Mark of the Lotus is a 1 mana spell that guarantees your minions are going to get +1/+1. Evolving Spores is a 4 mana spell that might give your minions +1/+1, so you're playing a 4x mana penalty to do the same thing. Now clearly this card has a little bit more flexibility, but often that flexibility even hurts it because you don't want to get something like Taunt, Can't Be Targeted, and Stealth if you're looking for really active on-board minion buffs. So ultimately this is the kind of card that's really expensive, has a ton of downside, and doesn't fit the kind of deck that you'd expect to like the card, and therefore it's so far a complete failure that hasn't seen any play in constructed format. And now at the number 7 spot on my list, this is the Druid Quest Jungle Giants. This one just has so many consistency issues. It turns out when you're trying to play a pretty late game style for Druid, ramp is really good, and having a card like Jungle Giants in your opening hand, which reduces the likelihood that you can actually draw ramp cards like Wild Growth, is actually rather punishing, not to mention the fact that when you even play the quest reward here and you reduce your minions' costs to 0, it's often just not fast enough as far as the board swing or tempo is concerned, and you never really get the chance to catch up. So people still haven't built a particularly successful deck with Jungle Giants. There are better ramp Druids, there are better ways to play Druid with token as well. So at the end of the day, this is just another one of those cards that trying to build around just means you're playing the class suboptimally, and that's a big problem for the card. At the number 6 spot is Emerald Hive Queen. I think this is a card that was envisioned in the Zombie Chow style as an early minion that trades really effectively and can be sort of defensively minded. But of course, Mistress of Mixtures is still in standard format, and it seems like it's a little bit better at accomplishing that goal, not to mention that Emerald Hive Queen's effect is way more punishing than Mistress or Zombie Chows ever were, because it can really influence your next few plays as well, leaving it in a very awkward space that just doesn't seem to work very well in any given environment, and that's exactly why we haven't seen this card, despite being a 1-mana 2/3, take off on the ranked ladder at all. Moving into the top 5, it's Frozen Crusher. Although this card's not particularly bad in Arena, it just doesn't make the cut in Constructed. With things like 4-mana 7/7s, 4-mana 8/8s with Mountain Giant, Frozen Crusher at the end of the day just doesn't seem all that cheap for an 8/8, particularly one that has this big of a downside. Typically decks that are looking to run really cheap big minions like this, for instance Bittertide Hydra, also in Journey to Ungoro, which is a pretty decent card, tend to want to do a lot of damage with it or hit face or present it as a really big threat for damage. But unfortunately, Frozen Crusher doesn't do that because he really only gets to attack once, and it gives your opponent more time to deal with it and resolve it, not to mention the fact that he's a little bit more expensive too, so he doesn't really fit in that environment. This card is theoretically okay in things like Silence Priest, but even then it's just a little slow, and there are better options out there when you're trying to make that work. It doesn't fit in Elemental decks either, so essentially it's a card that just doesn't have a home, and nobody really wants to play with it. And although that's just a little bit sad, unfortunately Frozen Crusher is not quite good enough. Up next at the number 4 spot is another quest, and it's not even the last one on the list. It's really unfortunate how many of the legendary quests actually made it onto this list. But the problem is, this is another one that when you try to build a deck with it, you're actively hurting your chances at victory. And that to me is exactly what defines a bad card. The Last Kaleidosaur is another one where trying to actually accomplish the quest's goals just sacrifices the integrity of your deck a little bit too much. And although Galvadon is a pretty cool reward that can sometimes just outright win you the game, far too often you lose the game on the way to actually receiving Galvadon, that it's just not worth it to run this, particularly when Paladin has 2 tier 1 decks in the meta right now. Why would you ever play Last Kaleidosaur when it's going to make you much, much, much less likely to actually win games on the ranked ladder in standard format? And as we move into the top 3, or should I say bottom 3, Licari Sacrifice, another quest that has been a complete failure. This one looked very promising pre-Unguro, but absolutely no one can build a good deck around this card. There's been a few okay decks, but there are better discard Zoo Warlock lists out there that don't run Licari Sacrifice, because once again, sacrificing a 1-drop, sacrificing a card in your opening hand, all on the way to a very difficult to accomplish quest, because discards, it turns out, still are rather punishing and rather difficult to work with and hard to predict and hard to control, all of which are things that make you worse in competitive environments. So Licari Sacrifice hurts your deck, it hurts your playstyle, and then even when you get the reward, Nether Portal is just too slow. It turns out developing a couple 3/2 minions for free is a super long-term value play, but in a game like Hearthstone where it's a little bit faster, things happen, and board presence and tempo really do matter, Licari Sacrifice just can't make the cut. And now as I move into my final 2 cards, Regis Kilbin fans out there in particular are going to be a little bit upset. I'm going to lose some subs. I'm going to get some hateful comments, but at the number 2 spot is Explore Unguro, a card which I think is hilarious and a lot of fun for meme-style decks, but unfortunately absolutely terrible in actual competitive decks. This thing is just, it doesn't work, right? It sacrifices your entire deck. It's sort of the Renounce Darkness style, but unlike Renounce Darkness, it doesn't even really have an upside, and then that card actually does give you some mana advantages when you play it. This one just takes all of your cards that you typically want to run, you want to play, they do specific things that you're trying to accomplish, and it sacrifices those in trade for the chance to draw some neutral minions, to get the Sabertooth Stalker, to get the Emerald Hive Queen, right? Very often random cards are just worse than cards that you intentionally include in your deck. So outside of having a lot of fun, which is a viable reason for a card to exist, by the way, but that's not what this list is talking about. Outside of that, though, this thing is just unplayable. Even when I've tested it as a last resort style card that replaces all the junk in your deck, Explore Unguro just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. the choices end up being terrible the majority of the time. And despite the fact that you do get to discover them and have some choice in the matter, they're just not good enough on average to make it worth it, leaving this card as nothing more than a fun little experiment and a card that I think we'll never actually see play in constructed format. And now moving on to my number one spot. It's the ultimate meme card, and I know that by including this here, I've just angered thousands of fans. I've just inspired millions of comments to tell me how crazy I am. But truly, as much as it pains me to say so, as much as I hate it, I really do think Ultrasaur, despite being the best dinosaur in history, is still probably the worst card in Journey to Un'Goro. Now, some people might say, how can you say that? He's just a vanilla minion. There's nothing about him that's actively bad. Some of the other cards have downsides. Some of the other cards hurt your deck's consistency. You just can't play them. But the same exact thing can be said for Ultrasaur, because he's a 10 mana minion. And in Hearthstone, you simply never have time to play a 10 mana minion that doesn't do anything immediate. So in other words, it doesn't have taunt. It doesn't force your opponents to attack through it. It doesn't have a battle cry that addresses the board. For instance, North Sea Kraken was a really expensive minion, vanilla beast for the most part, but it had that battle cry, right? Or still does have that battle cry that makes it so good at swinging the board, it does something active. And even that was a card we never really saw make the cut in constructed format. So how can a card like Ultrasaur? So what this ends up being is just an absolutely dead weight card that sits in your hand as a 10 mana card that you can't play the entire course of the game. And then when you get to 10 mana, you still can't afford to play Ultrasaur, because if you do, you'll be absolutely dead. So because of its cost, because of the lack of effects, Ultrasaur at the end of the day is an absolutely terribly, brokenly awful card. And as much as I love him, as much as it's fun to meme with Ultrasaur and that stupid grinning face that he has, unfortunately, at the end of the day, this is the worst card in Journey to Un'Goro. Okay. Put down your pitchforks. I already know you're mad that I put Ultrasaur at number one. That's where my heart and my brain tell me he belongs. He's the number one, right? He's number one, Ultrasaur, top of the list. All that said, guys, thank you so much for watching. This was a pretty difficult list to determine. There are unfortunately some bad cards in Un'Goro that are legendaries in particular, which made me really sad as I made this list. But I'm still curious what you guys have to say. What cards do you think are the worst in Un'Goro? Which cards have you had the worst luck with? What can you just not make work? Share all those thoughts and comments in the comments below, because I'll certainly be happy to read them. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.